Whatever thou art, stay away. Soon, I will be consumed by them, by the dark.
Hey there, my name is Alex, I am the Silvermont, and this is a video about Dark Souls, the lore and myths surrounding a legendary figure, teased and hinted at throughout the game. Back in 2011 we had no more than these mysterious tales to go by, until many of our questions were answered in the expansion, an expansion that shares the name of this fan favourite character, Artorias of the Abyss. Let us start with the name, Artorias. The most obvious connection would be with a certain Lucius Artorias Castus, a Roman who was thought to be the basis of King Arthur, the legendary British king, who fought against the Saxons and wielded magical swords, and led a proud company of knights. The specifics of the meaning behind Artorias do not seem of particular relevance, but Arthur has roots that could stem from Celtic, Artos meaning bear, then Viros for man, and Regos for king. Yet others speculate that Arthur does not come from Artorias. Perhaps more interesting is that Lucius from Lucius Artorias means light, a largely inconsequential but interesting thing to point out, given his role of bringing light into the abyss. Likewise a contrast with Kieran, whose name means Dark One, and Kieran is after all an assassin you might expect to find in the shadows. Or to put it another way, bringing darkness into light. There are also his titles to consider. Abysswalker Artorias, Artorias of the Abyss, and finally, his in-game title, Knight Artorias. Consider the difference here. The Dark Souls games are usually quite literal when it comes to boss names. Take Ornstein for example. His in-game name was not Knight Ornstein, nor was it Captain Ornstein. It was Dragon Slayer Ornstein, or the literal translation from Japanese, Dragon Hunting Ornstein. So why is it Knight Artorias instead of Abysswalker? Am I reading too much into it, or could that play into the fact that he was no true Abysswalker, and these legends that came after the fact were fabrications? But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Who is Artorias, and what was his role in Dark Souls? One of Gwyn's 4 knights, Artorias was perhaps the most famous of the bunch. Even though he never showed up in the game initially, he still played a large role. His crest could be bought from the blacksmith Andre, his ring could be found in the forest, and the great grey wolf Sif guards his tomb, along with his covenant with the Abyss, which was required by the chosen undead to make battle against the 4 kings. Prior to the expansion, what else did we know about him? Artorias had an unbendable will of steel and was unmatched with a greatsword. Sir Artorias hunted the dark wraiths, and his sword strikes harder against dark servants. The sword can damage ghosts, as it was cursed when Artorias joined a covenant with the creatures of the Abyss. That sums up the bulk of what we know about him. Initially, a knight of Gwyn who took up arms against the Abyss, hunting the dark wraiths and traversing the Abyss, and yet Alvina scoffed at the notion and claimed the legend of Artorias was a lie. And her claims turned out to have some truth to them. Upon reaching Ulasil and discovering the truth and the very soul of Artorias, black from corruption, we find that the legend that Artorias repelled the Abyss only told half the story. It seemed he was defeated and his honour preserved by some unsung hero who is the true victor of the Abyss. But how much of it was true? Did Artorias at least hunt the dark wraiths? Did he truly forge a covenant with the beasts or creatures of the Abyss? It would seem, perhaps, that he did. We do not know exactly what the game infers by beasts of the Abyss, but one possible theory, if it refers to anything, I believe it could refer to Alvina and Sif. Consider, Alvina in particular is no normal cat. She is a monstrous feline in appearance, and yet sharp of wit and tongue, and during the Chosen Undead's venture into the Abyss, she was able to traverse it without much seeming difficulty. Sif too could be another creature from the Abyss, but then we have to consider what is the Abyss. Manus is referred to as the father of the Abyss, and Goth remarks that it emanates from Manus. So in a way, you could believe that the Abyss is the dark soul of Manus, spreading uncontrollably. But is it possible the Abyss existed before as a more peaceful, quiet realm, and Manus's awakening corrupted it? Or could Alvina be born or twisted by the Abyss? Or are the creatures of the Abyss something else? Or nothing at all? What do you think? Either way, in ancient Ulasil, the Chosen Undead comes across Artorias, corrupted by the Abyss and seemingly dead. Although there is much speculation as to his exact state when fought, it is my belief at least that by that point there was nothing of Artorias left. Much like the Fume Knight Rain, his body was a corpse being controlled by a darker force. Posit. The death of the armor's owner can be surmised from the corrosive dark of the Abyss, and the tattered azure blue cape, once a symbol of pride and glory. The death of the armor's owner. Well, technically that came at our hands, but that description would heavily imply the being known as Artorias was already dead by the time we met him, no? Although the game does refer to the boss as Knight Artorias instead of, say, Abyss-consumed Knight, such as how Rain was referred to as Fume Knight. Good points to consider either way. And that is the second time I've brought Rain up, for he was a spiritual successor to Artorias in many ways. Artorias entered Ulasil in a bid to save Princess Dusk, yet in his hubris or simple ignorance challenged a force far beyond his mean, all by himself, save for his companion, Sif. Consumed by the Abyss, Artorias left a trail through Ulasil, making it almost as far as the Royal Woods before being put down by the Chosen Undead. Before word could spread that the Great Knight had fallen. Rain, on the other hand, was once a knight of King Vendrick who quarrelled with another knight, Velstart, over reasons unknown, they are never mentioned in-game, and left in search of a greater power. Becoming enraptured by Nadalia, a child of the Abyss, he was killed, perhaps willingly giving his life to her, and controlled by the Bride of Ash. Indeed, some even believe the majestic greatsword was once in Rain's possession, and that it is proof both he and Artorias were left-handed. Which, well, let's touch on that briefly, shall we? There is a popular theory as to Artorias being left-handed, which stems from two main sources. First of all, the flat-out wrong belief that this is supposed to be Artorias. It is not. And then we have the majestic greatsword in Dark Souls 2, which is a form of the greatsword of Artorias, and remarks that each of those who inherited the sword were left-handed. Artorias did not inherit the sword, it was his sword. Sif, on the other hand, did inherit the divine knight sword. Does that mean Sif was left-handed? In-game and in all official images, Artorias is right-handed. His left arm hangs limp, which would suggest he attempted to use his divine shield to defend against either the wandering humanity sprites or Manus himself, and had his arm shattered. It was then the Abysswalker left behind his shield, using it to guard Sif in his last moments. Whether or not Artorias is left-handed or not is largely irrelevant, but there is a left-handed knight to root for. Why, look no further than the Ivory King, another character with parallels to Artorias. Along with the Abyss, the legacy of Artorias is evident throughout the franchise. In Dark Souls 3 in particular, we have Farron's Legion, the Abyss Watchers, warriors who partake of the wolf blood and emulate ancient Artorias as wardens against the darkness. The Legion would destroy entire cities at the first sign of abyssal corruption. Their fighting style is, curiously enough, based on the corrupted Artorias. They use no shields, and erratic are their movements, wielding great swords in their right hands and parrying blades in their left. And yet, so far as we are aware, the only beings who would have possibly known about Artorias in this state would be the chosen undead, and possibly Chester, Elizabeth, and Goff. So where did the Abyss Watchers receive this fighting style, this information? A mystery, or perhaps an oversight on the developer's perspective? The best answer, the best reasoning I can think of would be the wolf's blood left behind by Artorias. Maybe it was through this blood that his successors would learn of his final moments and inherit that infamous, crazed fighting style. Fittingly, Artorias was somewhat of a lone wolf, and you could also say there is perhaps some irony in that, given Farron's legion are anything but. Even so, we know that Artorias nurtured a relationship with Sif, the great grey wolf, and was presumably on good terms with his compatriots, Goff, Ornstein, and Kieran. The last in particular harboured deep affections for the Abysswalker, it seems, although it would also seem the feelings were not returned. Presumably he knew of Alvina too, but judging from his unused dialogue, it would appear Artorias had a strong sense of duty, and a deep connection, indeed, with the wolf.
Sif, there you are. All of you. Forgive me, for I have availed you nothing.
The fact that this dialogue was cut from the game further reinforces my thinking that Artorias is dead when we encounter him. Plus the atmosphere of the fight in general is improved without dialogue, I would say. That said, the voice actor did a pretty damn good job with his limited lines, and it's really interesting to hear them at the very least. And it's also worth pointing out that this means, in some form, we have heard every one of Gwyn's knights, even Smo to a certain extent from his giggles, but not Ornstein. I wonder what he sounds like. It is also worth pointing out, perhaps, that in Japan, red and blue are often thought as the hero and sidekick or rival colours. Dante and Virgil from Devil May Cry, Ichigo and Ishtar from Bleach, Goku and Vegeta from Dragon Ball, Edward and Alphonse Elric from Fullmetal Alchemist, and so on and so forth. Often, the red is indicative of a character's passion and brash nature, whereas the blue character is cool, calm, and collected. Of course, there are subversions of this trope, but it is a common one indeed, and it makes you wonder, is that the case with Ornstein and Artorias? Ornstein was thought of as the captain of the Four Knights and has a colour scheme of gold and red, whereas Artorias is silver and blue. We don't know much about Ornstein's personality, but we know Artorias was a lone wolf. Perhaps we can extrapolate a little about them from that trope. Maybe Ornstein was the fiery, passionate one. And you know, despite Artorias rocking the superior colour scheme, he has silver of course, I do have to side with Ornstein, the Leo Knight. Both had legacies that spread throughout the series, the Dragon Hunter and the Wolf Knight. The legend of Artorias was preserved and created both by the chosen undead. A nameless knight who did what no god, no divine champion could manage, quell the abyss and put to rest that dreadful primeval man. And yet, who was it that awoke the father of the abyss? And for what purpose?
Thou art strong, human. Surely thine kind are more than pure dark. I beg of thee, the spread of the abyss must be stopped.